And I'll give everyone a few minutes to file into the room before we get started. And just another half a minute here.
I recognize at least one name there. Hello,
Hi.
Marilyn.
I had a feeling that you would recognize some of our directors. Yeah, I bet. All righty. Well, with that, I am going to get started. People are filing in and finding their seats and getting comfortable. So I'll just go through my introduction and then we'll be ready to go. Welcome everyone to the Michigan CASA Education Series. My name is Jane Becker. I'm the Director of Training, and on behalf of Patty Sabin, our President and CEO, and Jennifer Collins, our Director of Operations, we thank you for joining us today. I'm broadcasting from my dining room table here in Glen Arbor, and where I am happy to say it is sunny. So I'm going to celebrate that, and it's about time. We're grateful for that, but we're also grateful for the GMB Foundation for their generous gift that will support our ongoing education series trainings throughout 2022. Now, a little bit about Michigan CASA, in case there are people on here that may not know a lot about us. We are a nonprofit organization. We knit together our local programs from 28 counties in Michigan, and we provide those local organizations support services such as learning opportunities, marketing help, and opening new programs. All of this is all done in order to change the lives of abused and neglected children throughout the state of Michigan. And the end goal is the same as yours, to end the cycle of child abuse, one child at a time. We are so happy to have so many of our volunteer advocates with us today who want to learn more about this topic so they can represent their child's needs more effectively. You stand up for children and you give children in foster care a voice. And just to let you know, you are nearly 800 strong throughout the state of Michigan, serving 1,300 children. If you combine all of your hours of service, we come up to 52,000 hours of service to children every year. And it's because of your advocacy, a child is more likely to find a safe and permanent home. They're more likely to succeed in school, and they're half as likely to re-enter the foster care system. You volunteers have our profound gratitude. And we also welcome our local CASA staff and our colleagues from associated organizations. We thank you for so tirelessly supporting our volunteers. It makes a huge impact. I just want to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the Michigan CASA website, michigancasa.org. It'll be under the Learning tab along with most of our past presentations. Now, because it's a webinar and not a Zoom meeting, you're not going to see your little square on the screen, but you can still interact. Use the chat room. Several of you are bidding everyone a good morning. And I love that. Consider the chat room your opportunity to lean over and chat with the person sitting next to you. But use the Q&A if you have questions for Dr. Siders. I will be fielding those and we'll make sure we get those questions to her. So questions in the Q&A, chat in the chat. All right, now a little bit about our presenter. Dr. Amelia Siders is the Director of Clinical Practice Development and Education at the Children's Advocacy Centers of Michigan. Dr. Siders helps to support the clinical and victim advocacy operations throughout the state. Her goal is to make training, practice, and support easily accessible, so that all CAC staff can focus on providing current state-of-the-art, evidence-based services to victims of child abuse and their families. Dr. Siders is a licensed psychologist who has been working with children and families for over 20 years. Prior to working with the child advocacy centers, she was the program director and clinical supervisor for the Traverse Bay Children's Advocacy Center. And I also have to kind of add what a thrill it was for this NPR nerd one day when I was listening to A Way with Words, and all of a sudden one of the phone-in participants announced that she was Amelia Siders from Traverse City, Michigan. And you know, we word nerds and NPR nerds have to kind of stick together. So, all right. So we're really happy to have Dr. Siders with us. And now I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane. And thank you for the invitation. I too am incredibly grateful for the work of CASAs throughout the state. I've had the great privilege of working with many of you in different types of situations and cases, and observed work that you've done. So thank you so much for everything that you're doing. Hi, Jennifer. I see several people that I know. And I'm still in Traverse City, just so you know. I'm just not, I work remotely for CACs of Michigan. So I am still here and get to enjoy still living in Traverse City. I just am not working at the Traverse Bay CAC anymore. So thank you. All right, so I want to get started. What my goal today is to certainly put questions in the Q&A, and Jane will field those. And if they seem to be timely, she'll interrupt me. I have no problem with that. It is not super formal in how we are going about that. I will be asking you some questions, just kind of put in your initial response into the chat box too, just for some interaction. But just know that if you have something important that you want to ask, please go ahead and do that. I am trying to do an overview of certain concepts and issues related to trauma, but then try to apply it hopefully to your work in some meaningful ways as we go through this. All right, so let's get started. What I'm going to do just quickly first is do a little overview of quickly, because I think many of you might have been familiar, have heard of adverse child experiences by now. We've kind of talked about these things a lot. So just to do a quick reorientation to that issue, but there's 10 types of childhood trauma measured in this gigantic study, which is a seminal study that was done many, many years ago now, but had such a gigantic pool of people from kind of all walks of life, which was really nice to look at some things that adverse child experiences impact as far as right now with people, and then in the future for health and consequences, mental health and physical health. So we have kind of different types. 5 of them are personal, physical, verbal, sexual abuse, physical neglect, and emotional. And then 5 of the ACEs, so there's 10 total, also look at kind of family members. So having a parent who has drug and alcohol problems, witnessing or having parents that have been victims of domestic violence, somebody that is incarcerated, having a parent incarcerated, a family member diagnosed with mental illness, divorce, other types of things. So each type of trauma counts as 1 ACE score. So the more ACEs that you have, the higher you're going to possibly, it's not a definite thing, you could possibly experience some health consequences. So we call this a dose response relationship. And typically 3 to 4 is considered to be looking kind of on the higher range of an ACE score. Obviously, the higher you go, the more likely you're going to have more complicated issues going on. So that you can have physical health, heart disease, obesity, and then psychological issues, depression, anxiety, addiction, and these things are just to name a few. We see tons and tons of relationships, I can tell you, in my field between substance use disorders and trauma experience. So that's how majority of people, when they experience trauma and they aren't getting the help they need, are figuring out ways to deal and manage with the trauma. Substance use is going to be the biggest go-to for them. So people with ACE scores are 2 to 4 times more likely to use alcohol, just as I was saying. And what we know is that children that experience sexual abuse, many of these children have other ACEs, which can result in significant consequences. And so it's just so important that we think about not only, the thing that you might be supporting and dealing with that child, that case or that issue, because obviously these ACEs are things you're very familiar with, because these are the types of cases you're getting to support these children, especially kids in foster care. And know that the earlier we can support and get them help and intervention, the better they're going to do. So the other really important thing that I cannot stress enough is so some of you will be looking at those ACEs that I talked about, and you might be checking off a few of those boxes yourself. It is extremely common, and especially people like us who go into this field to help children. Many of us do that because we've had personal experiences that lead us to really want to support kids as well. So really understanding that what our stuff is and what we bring into it and what our responses or reactions may be to working with certain cases, and how that interacts with the child's stuff, and kind of being able to take a step back sometimes and try to recognize maybe where it might be more your stuff than their stuff that you're responding to. That happens to me a lot with working with parents, especially challenging parents that I might have to interact with in the system. I know that I have to kind of check and be aware of what my stuff is and how I'm responding to something with these children, that's more about my own issues related to the parents, when I need to be putting what the child needs and their issues related to, regardless of what I may be feeling about that parent. So one of the biggest things that I think is important to understand about trauma and sexual abuse and all types of other types of trauma is the concept of activation. Because when you're going to be interacting with some of these children, especially maybe the first few times that you are meeting with them, these kids are probably in a highly stressed environment, or something's going on that they're feeling extremely worried or concerned about. And then you're coming to meet with them. They don't know you. They may not have any experience of you. And so it's very stressful for them. And so, and we need to also understand that when children are not raised by caregivers who keep them safe, who are able to participate in, if a caregiver also, and not because they necessarily are a bad person, but because of their own trauma and history, they're not modeling any of the regulation and the modulation strategies for kids. So it's really the core kind of piece of traumatic stress is a breakdown in the capacity to regulate their internal states. So if a child is living in a constant state of distress, they really don't know how to decide what is bad, what is good, what is truly a thing they need to be worried about, and what isn't, because they're just constantly feeling bombarded with things. And so children who are likely to be intolerably distressed, they don't really have a good sense that the external environment is able to provide relief. So they are not looking to others or to things in their environment, as some kids would, to seek out comfort. And so they are just looking at things that they may be doing to calm themselves down. And most of the time, those are not healthy things. I think we see this a lot in young people who are cutting, things like that. They may be engaging in these behaviors to calm themselves down, self-harm behaviors, because it relieves kind of the stress for them, but it's not a healthy way. But no one has really kind of modeled those healthy things for them. So when we are thinking about activation, it's helpful to look at this. And so the next two diagrams are some of my favorites when we talk about things. It's a simple way of thinking about it, but what can we really expect from children and their caregivers who have their own sexual abuse or trauma when they're activated? Okay, so children have insecure attachment patterns, and they don't know how to really rely on others to help them, but they can't regulate their emotional states themselves. And part of this is because what's happening is the simple way to think about this is the upstairs and downstairs brain. So the downstairs brain, that part is our core functioning. And that's looking at more reflective responses and basic bodily functions, just kind of how we react initially or emotionally to fear, attachment, fight, flight, and freeze. Okay. The upstairs brain is what really helps us manage and understand and mitigate some of the feelings that may be coming up when we're feeling activated or stressed. So it has to do with decision-making, planning, self-understanding. Self-understanding is a big one, right? If you kind of know why you're getting upset, people that are not engaged and activated cannot really understand and have that sense of themselves very well. So we have that disconnect when you're activated between the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain. Okay, so these children, and it's important to look at the difference between these two things when we think about activation, because the easiest way to think about activation is to think about it as a child who's out of control or very upset or angry or sad or running around the room and can't calm down. But another way to think about activation is also when we look at so that's called hyperarousal, hyperaroused child, is hypoarousal. So those kids, and I'm sure you see these too, are the ones that are very disengaged from the environment, that seem like they're spaced out, seem like they're kind of disconnected from their emotions, they're numb. That's another way to be activated. When you get upset, if you've learned that getting upset and acting out doesn't get you anywhere, you may just then kind of disengage from the world and space out. So those are two different things to look at and understand, but it's really important to think about hypo-aroused children as well as hyper-aroused children. Is there a question, Jane, in the...
Sorry, I had to unmute. There is a question, and this might be a good time for it, or we can save it till the end. Carrie makes the note, one thing I have never understood is how ACEs were chosen. I get that the first iteration were likely chosen by logic, but is there research to evaluate other possible ACEs and the relative impact of each of these? It seems to be that there are likely others and that not all the ACEs have the same amount of negative impact.
I think that's a really good point. How they originally came up with it, it was more of a factor analysis of data. So they labeled, what happened, they tried to find commonalities when they looked through all of these health questionnaires of thousands and thousands of people. And so they weren't chosen as much as these 10 at least, but they were the most common kind of how the data clumped together. So they tended to clump together statistically significantly in these 10 areas. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't other areas. They just did not find statistical significance to have those other areas. So we don't want, and I think that's a really good point to make about ACEs, is that it doesn't mean that if you have other experiences, those haven't been stressful for you. But I would say the one area that we are not really assessing as well related to ACEs is related to racial trauma and experiences for people of color. So that is something that I think they're looking into assessing better, because I don't think they asked those questions in the original ACE questionnaire. But I can tell you that a lot of the research coming out related to that is that there is racial trauma that we need to assess, and just the experience sometimes of experiencing different cultural experiences and the trauma related to that is something that ACEs does not really address. So it's something to think about as well. So very good point. I hope I answered the question, at least generally.
You did, thank you.
So this next slide is one of my favorite slides. So it's I love this flipping your lid slide, but I think it's helpful for us to be able to get it, but also sometimes when we explain to foster parents, if you're trying to explain to a child about why they may not be able to deal with things in that particular moment. And so kind of like the upstairs downstairs brain, it's the same concept. So this area here are all our big emotions and our activation and all of the things that we're responding to when we feel stressed. And they might be say, run away, get out of there, yell at the person, hit somebody. dissociate, go into yourself, right? So when you have something happen that triggers you, you have these big emotions. Now, for most of us, we have this wise mind, which is the other part. That's that upstairs brain that can work together with those big emotions and mitigate some of those responses. We still may be upset, but we kind of go, well, you know what? This isn't as big of a threat as some of the other things. So I don't have to get as upset as I would for something else. And so, but what happens when a child is living in a constant state of stress, when they haven't been able to really distinguish the difference between a real threat and a perceived threat, that they flip their lid. So that all we're doing is we're living in this activated world, okay? And so they're not going to be able to participate in really good responses. They can't really talk about their safety. They can't talk about all of the things when you're trying to process with them at the time. So trying to process with a child when their lid is flipped and say, well, let's talk about your feelings. They're not able to do those things. They don't have the self-awareness when their lid is flipped. So, and it doesn't mean that they never have this together, but we may have to do more. And we'll talk about that in a minute too, about for CASAs, some things to think about when you need to interview a child and you're talking to them about things. But just recognizing that if you notice signs of the lid being flipped, that's not the time to probably getting them to participate in safety planning or understanding about things, or even give you some of those kind of ideas about what they need from you. Okay. So that's just a thing to think about when we're working with these children. There's a Q&A. Is there a question that would make sense to answer right now?
Well, let me throw it out and you can decide, and we can save it for later if you want. Is anyone researching the impact of having a gender non-conforming parent or sibling? In my experience, this seems to be an unaddressed trauma.
I do not have any data that I could speak to, at least related to that. I don't know that. I think it depends, really. I think the big thing there would not be having that person. It would be the family's cultural norm and belief system and how that interacts with how they perceive that issue. So I think that would have more to do with it than that having somebody who's non-conforming or has gender identity issues. So that'd be my quick answer. Right. I think that it's more about how people perceive things that can induce trauma or stress for families than the actual thing itself. And we'll be talking about that in a little bit. So looking through this trauma lens, and that's the thing, when you go to a home or when you go meet with a child, kind of thinking about this perspective and what do I need to be paying attention to when I'm going to be talking to a child that could be impacting their ability to participate in working with me, at least then or in the future. So this is a picture of, I'm just going to use this as an example. This is a picture of my office back when I was working at the Traverse Bay Children's Advocacy Center. So it has lots of light. It has, I tried to make it kind of a welcoming place for both parents and children. And this would be a chat question. So for you guys to do something in the chat, could you tell me if you're looking at this room and you think about somebody who might have a history of any type of trauma, is there anything in the room that you think could be threatening to them? So, and you can put your guesses into the couch.
Would you like me to read these aloud, Amelia?
I can see them actually.
Okay.
I've got them up.
Okay.
Got bright light, couch. Abby's heard me tell this story before. Visibility others through uncovered windows, right? This flowers on the wall. I'll just give it another second here to see if anyone else wants to put anything in. Yep, anything that might be right. So I think that the office space, right, where somebody's sitting might be. So the bottom line is that what we need to understand is that I can create as cozy and welcoming as an office or be meeting with a child in a place that I think is safe. But that's my perception of the room, that anything can be perceived as threatening to somebody who's had trauma, depending upon what's going on. And so my example of the story that I always tell related to this picture has to do with a woman that I met with, the parent that I met with when I was trying to get information for her about working with her child. Her child had come into the CAC after an interview, and she never could seem to relax. She would sit in the couch. She would kind of rock back and forth. She seemed very distracted and stressed. I met with her once. She cut the meeting short. She left. I had her come back in. And at that second meeting, started seeing some of those same behaviors come up. So I asked her, I said, I'm just wondering, is there anything I'm doing or saying, or is there anything I can do to make this more comfortable for you? And is there anything going on that I need to know about? And she looked over at the lamp, which is in the corner there by the sofa, the end of the sofa on that table. And she said, it's that lamp. And I said, what? And she said, well, this lamp, that's the lamp that my husband used to almost beat me to death with. And now I knew that it was not the lamp, the actual lamp, but it was the same. It looked exactly the same to her as the lamp that had been used. And, I can't remember now that I look back if she said that was the lamp or that is like the lamp, but either way, it was clear that she was re-experiencing trauma by just sitting next to this lamp. And she felt threatened the whole time she was in there, even though I would never, ever pick up something and hurt somebody with it. That's not who I am. She doesn't know that. And so she can't participate in even asking questions about her child because she's too activated. So that happens with kids all the time as well. But I just want to use that example. We're thinking about where and how we talk to people and what could be, resulting in their behavior. So the other pieces, and of course, here I go. I have cats that love to jump up and be on Zoom. So we'll see if my cat just jumped up on my lap here. Understanding some really interesting critical concepts here when we're working with people, and this is going to be the parents too, the people, anyone that could be foster parents, it could be the biological parents if you have to talk to them and interview them with things, or other caregivers in the home, is that people that have a history of trauma have not been really treated well for it and dealing with it, and really have a hard time telling the difference between a perceived threat and a real threat. And so the perception of the stressor is really what the response is, not the actual stressor. So it could be something like, again, if we say, well, work stresses me out, and you said this is a very broad example. And I would say, well, not every day you go to work does it stress you out, but there are things that happen and your perception of certain people and activities at work that are leading to your stress, but it's not work itself. So understanding the difference between a perceived threat and a real threat. They have trouble distinguishing between being safe when they really are, like that woman in my office. I could tell you she was safe and there's nothing that was going to happen to her, but if she doesn't feel safe, then she's not safe. She has to feel safe to be safe, and she can't tell the difference because she's in that activated space. Being scared and being danger mean the same thing for many people. So the second they are scared, they feel they are in danger. So it could be, I worked with a child who got triggered a lot in a classroom, and a teacher got upset one time, was just sitting at their desk and starts with the finger, I told you that. And that child, immediately after seeing the teacher just doing this and talking to them that way, and they weren't even anywhere near them, they were across the room, they hid under the desk because for them, that trigger was how a parent that'd be the precursor to violence in the home. Is that where it would start? They would amp up, they would get upset. That teacher was not threatening the child in any way, was not doing that, but they started to feel scared. They had to make themselves safe by getting under the desk. So any type of kind of breach of that integrity is going to lead to some of these behaviors. So we need to understand that and not personalize some of these responses, that we're doing something wrong, because we could do all the right things in the world in our perception, but that does not mean that that person is going to feel that way, the same way that we are. Let's see here, we've got a few questions in the
I think I handled
Okay,
those.
great. Thanks, Abby. I'm glad you like that story. It's one of my favorite stories. So when we look at your work, I want to take a minute to think about this issue because, and you can certainly feel free to put it in the chat box, different environments. So can you kind of put some different environments you meet and speak to children? Because I think that will help me to understand. But so daycare, okay, school. Those are some good ones. Foster home, summer camp, okay. Institutional setting, okay. Parents home, okay. So those are the things I was thinking as well. So I think courthouse, all right, excellent. So I want you to think about that. And I want you to, as you get to know your kid and you read through the case file of the child that you are going to be representing and supporting, thinking about if I'm going to talk to a child in their home, okay, and so the parent's home and they're still in the home, maybe looking and kind of identifying and even asking the child if there's certain rooms that they feel more comfortable or less comfortable in for me to talk to them before I would do that. Because again, they could be in a space where something happened to them or something happened to somebody else in their family. And if you don't know that necessarily, but if you're going to meet with them in the living room and that's a triggering space for them, they're going to be more distracted. They're going to be harder to focus, and because they'll be more activated. So I think that, the courthouse, Bart talks about, yeah, and I think the courthouse, thinking about systems too. So how these children have been talked to about systems. So if they have been told by a parent, if you tell anyone what's happening, they're going to take you away from me, I'm going to go to jail forever. And then they have to be interviewed at the courthouse. They're going to associate that courthouse as a place that's going to get their parent in trouble and something bad's going to happen. So sometimes it's educating a child and just asking some questions about how they're feeling about things before you may kind of take another step. And let me get to the therapy stuff at the end, Sarah. So Jane's going to save that, but I think it's a very good question and we'll talk about that. Making sure that you know what the environments are and maybe thinking about possible triggers in an environment. You're not going to know all of them, but sometimes you may just have to ask the child. And then the systems that, they have to interact with. So if they have, and one of the things that we pay attention to at children's advocacy centers that many of you know, is that the police investigators that are involved in cases typically do not wear or do not interact with the kids all the time, or if they're doing interviews in their uniforms or having a gun on them, because all of those things, especially if a child has an experience with law enforcement or has grown up in a household where they have been told law enforcement is bad, they can't trust them. That's already a setup. So thinking about systems and how we need to talk to kids about those systems from maybe an understanding perspective from how they see them. Because just telling kids, well, officer so-and-so is a safe person and you're in court and that's the person who's going to be there, the bailiff or whatever. If they don't interpret those people as being safe people, we need to kind of listen to that and talk through it and not just challenge or correct them in how they're thinking. So it's really important. And, if a child's forced to choose which parent, Bart talks about that it's so stressful and triggering for a child. And to put a child in that situation, I think is very, how do they make a choice like that? It's an awful thing to have to do. So another, and this is in your slides, which I think I gave in full page form so that you could look at this. This slide is great because it's related again to activation, and it talks about the hypoarousal, which I spoke about before, but it really looks at your window of tolerance. So another thing to think about when you are meeting with a child or an adolescent is, and paying attention to maybe in those first few visits, is how long are they able to kind of maintain? Because for many kids, they might have a little teeny window of tolerance to be able to maintain questions and talk, and then they're activated and they can't do it. And so the goal is to work with kids to regulate them as much as we can. And so how you present, the more regulated and calm you are, even saying, hey, before we get started to talk today, let's take I like to take 3 deep breaths. before I even start talking to anybody to calm down, because I'm a little nervous meeting you today because I've heard so many good things about you, and I want you, I want you to feel like you can trust me. And I'm feeling a little nervous about that because you don't know me. So do you see how you're modeling to the child appropriate feelings, identifying your feelings? Those types of things can really humanize you to a child in reading for the first time, but also modeling, taking a deep breath, taking that you're stressed, and how you're handling that. So just understanding the difference there and how trauma can affect the window of tolerance. The more trauma and stressors we have, the shorter kind of window and the smaller window we have to tolerate things that are going on in our environment. So you may need to think about talking to a child over a few times for even a shorter thing that you want to do versus a longer meeting, depending upon just how much they can maintain. And so thinking about that, because you might have better luck and get more information that way. So there's different types of trauma. So there's, a child that experiences kind of one thing that happens. And then the police are called and something. It could be they witnessed some horrible violent act and they may not have any other history of things. There's the chronic ongoing trauma. So it could be witness to violence, it could be ongoing sexual abuse that happens, repeated episodes over time. And then complex trauma is when we have different types of trauma that are going on all at once or at different times in the child's life. So they could have something really traumatic happen when they're 3, and then something different when they're 5, and then ongoing abuse starting from 6 to 10. Okay. So complex trauma obviously is much more difficult to treat because there's lots more things to sort out and deal with. And the other thing to really kind of distinguish here for trauma and understanding things is that I know that I've gone into many situations when I've gotten referred a child who would get interviewed at the Children's Advocacy Center, of what I assume must be the thing that's upsetting them the most that's happened to them. But that may not be remotely true for what's going on with that child. And so some children may not have significant trauma related to ongoing sexual abuse. And so we'll talk about, we have to let a child lead us to where their trauma is, not us leading the child. It's very, very important to not label things for them, let them label things for us. But it may not be what we expect. Their response may be not what they expect. And it doesn't mean that if a child doesn't demonstrate trauma, that they're going to have it later on. It could, but we don't have to assume that they're delaying things or they're denying things. Unfortunately, some kids are used to living in a chaotic environment, and that's what they're used to. But an example of this, of course, choosing your trauma would be a story where this was something I was taught in a training, so it was not my own experience, but it was a psychologist who was working with a woman who had experienced a lot of sexual abuse and really significant trauma as a child. And she had disclosed a rape she was raped by 3 or 4 boys in a playground. She and her younger sister were playing in the playground, and a gang of boys came up and started chasing them and caught her and raped her repeatedly. And so she was having a lot of issues going on in her life, and she had talked about this event. And the psychologist felt like that was going to be, well, gosh, that could damage somebody for a long time, that experience. And what she talked about, though, when she talked about this, is to say no for her, because she had this rape happen and it was horrible, but her sister got away. And because her sister got away when they were running, she felt like she saved her sister, and they did this to her, but her sister was safe. And so for her, how she understood and processed this trauma, she did not have as much trauma related to this and symptoms related to this because she actually felt she did something protective. Okay. And again, that's her interpretation. We don't get to decide how someone interprets something like that. But for her, it was the chronic neglect by her mother she was the product of a sexual assault herself and was the oldest of all of these girls, all of the rest of her siblings were the biological children of her mother and her father who raised her, but she was not. She was the product of a rape. And her mother had spent her entire life barely acknowledging her. She never was hugged by her mom. She was never given any emotional support or even told that she was loved. And so for her, that was far more traumatic than the rape. So just an example of how people experience and understand their own trauma is really important for us to ask. And so one of the things in therapy we ask, but it's something that you can ask, if there's a bunch of things you're reading through that the child's experienced, starting out a conversation saying, well, help me to understand, of all the things that have happened to you, what's bothering you the most? That's going to be a good place to start for them and will help you kind of guide maybe some of the recommendations, the ideas that you have. Because again, the investigators could assume what's bothering them most. The court can assume what's bothering them most and what they have to protect them from, but let that child tell you what's bothering them most, because that may give you a lot more information. This is just a slide that reviews really when we treat trauma, the first thing that has to happen is we need to provide a safe place for a child. So the pyramid is when there's trauma going on, most people are just kind of trying to be surviving that trauma, right? And get through things. So that has to be there. That's the foundation of just being safe and surviving. Then we can start to work on physical and emotional regulation and helping a child kind of deal with and process and just calm down to be able to engage in therapy and things like that. Then the social emotional connections come in. Then the thought process and the change in how they think about themselves and the world. And so that's much later. So part of what you do and your job is helping kids is figuring out where they're going to be safe and advocating for what the best place would be. So that's why you're really helping with that foundational piece with kids and how critically important that is. But understanding, and when you're trying to explain a child's behavior, even in foster care, if they're acting out, is that they're not feeling safe yet. So until they really understand and have a long time of consistent things going on, they may not feel safe. So understanding that when you're advocating for the kids and when people are interpreting their behavior, that's something that you might be able to help people understand more than they may be understanding. So this is the good, these are a few of the good slides. So when we talk about how people are coping and dealing with things, positive experiences outweigh negative experiences. So even those interactions you're having that are short can be wonderfully healing and supportive for a child. Okay. So that what you're doing is good. And even if you can't solve or save everything related to what's going on with this child, the fact that you are listening to them and you are being positive and supportive is extremely important. So it just says resilience requires supportive relationships and opportunities for skill building. And everything that we can do to support kids in learning to cope with manageable threats to our physical, being is critical to develop resilience. Now, this is an experience, this is something to point out too, is that when we're looking at children's behaviors and trying to understand them, some children are going to respond in more extreme ways to both negative and positive experiences. So we get the negative, we talked about like something, teacher pointing, boom, they're under the desk, right? But we don't think about positive experiences. So this is another thing to think about. When you go in and you're meeting with a child, and you may have had this experience, some of you, where you're trying to give them the best positive experience you can. You're trying to compliment them. You're telling them, oh my gosh, I noticed how well you did in school. Your teachers are saying this, you're saying all of this, but you're getting a weird response from the child. They're blowing that off. They're trying to change the subject. You have to understand that some children, people saying positive things to them, supportive, kind things, feels upsetting to them because they're not used to it. And it's a horribly heartbreaking thing to think about. But if kids are in abusive, environments, if there's sexual abuse, there's physical abuse and things going on, sometimes a compliment can be more upsetting to them and trigger them because they think, oh, this person sees this good in me, but it's not going to be long before they see that that's not true. So so sometimes just thinking about even asking them, if you notice that a child is responding to a positive comment, sometimes I said, well, I've noticed that seems to bug you. Is that something that you don't want me to do? She's like, yeah, please, just don't. It's hard for me to hear compliments. And I have teenagers tell me that all the time. And it's not that. So, well, what are some ways that I could point out positive things, but not feel like a compliment? So I'm like, I still want to tell you stuff that's good. It's the strength that you have, but how do I do it in a way that's not going to feel uncomfortable? So some of that is just working with the child and coming up with those ideas.
And if I can just interrupt, this isn't a question, but a comment that Bart offered. He'd like to add that being listened to isn't an immediate response to listening reaction. Children are high self-monitors and will be, for all practicalities, paranoid. Mm-hmm. So I think I appreciate that addition.
Yep, that's a good point. Thanks, Bart. And that the earlier that we can work on resilience and building those skills, the better. But it doesn't matter how old you are, you can still develop resilience and learn to be better. And resilience does not mean, and I want to clarify this, it does not mean that you should ignore the bad things that have happened to you, or that, some people now are getting triggered by the word resilience, saying, I need you to honor the fact that these horrible things happened to me, instead of saying how resilient I am. And I think we can do both. And so I talk about, to me, resilience isn't a word I use as much as surviving. So I talk to kids about how I don't like to use the word victim of abuse or victim of sexual abuse. I like to be survivor, because they are sitting here in this room, and that means they survived it. And that means they have the ability, even if some of those things weren't as healthy that they had to do to survive, that they got through it. And that is an incredible thing. And so just sometimes how we pay attention to language is important. This is just a nice diagram that looks at all the different ways that childhood trauma can impact children. But I'm looking at the time, so I want to be sensitive to that. So I'm going to move through that. The next two slides are some examples of some things when we think about what you guys do. This is the problem with trauma and sexual abuse, is that it can look like many different things. There's not one thing that you're going to be able to say, oh, well, this means this child has been abused or traumatized. Because some of those things could mean that, some of them can mean other things. But, these are the things that correlate with trauma. We're looking at statistics. So obviously we talked about ACEs, using drugs and alcohol to cope, the daydreaming, dissociation, that checking out, getting in trouble more, not taking care of themselves and their appearance, not going to school, refusing to go to school, just all of those things that make sense, right? That are just kind of warning signs that something is going on. And so to me, this is what trauma can look like. We may not know what specific type of trauma is happening, but it might give us an idea of just asking a child some questions. Well, tell me about this. I noticed that you skipped and you haven't been in school. Is there anything that I need to know that would help me understand better of why it's hard to be at school? Okay, so trying to figure out from these kids what's kind of behind some of those behaviors. This I gave you a copy of in the materials that Jane has. So this is just a really nice, one of the things Jane had said you guys were asking for was an idea of just understanding what are some of the things to pay attention to in terms of children at risk. And so this is actually from the Michigan Alliance for Drug Endangered Children. But it's a nice checklist just to kind of pay attention for. So I thought it would be helpful to have in here with the slides, and you will get the PDF copy of the full document. Just to think about what kinds of things that we want to pay attention to that are going on in the home. What is kind of, emotional abuse, physical abuse, neglect, those types of things. And Mary, I don't know if Jane has sent it out or if she's going to have it available, but I'm sure you guys will get it. Don't worry.
It will be uploaded to the Michigan CASA website. I'll type that in just a second.
So for a lot of these children, school, becomes, a punishment. Absolutely. And especially if they have to go to a new school because they're put in foster care and it's in a different place. And we think about, we may be helping these kids be safe, but that doesn't always mean some kids would like to trade being safe for being at their old school. Thinking about all of these things from a child's perspective, not just from our higher level understanding of how they are safe. this is just a slide that talks about the things that it impacts in a different way. It's just a nice little different slide of emotions and relationships and interpersonal things. So what we can really do when we're looking at improving our approach and interactions with kids is changing our understanding of problem behaviors. Instead of labeling a child as being a difficult child, or kind of going along trying to change the language other people might be using. Oh God, this kid's a pain in the ass, or this is, thinking, well, what's happened to them. So I think that, you've heard this before, instead of what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you we need to frame. And then I also like, instead of what's wrong with you, what's strong with you, because many times the behaviors that kids are doing, if they're fighting, if they're, that those behaviors have helped them survive in the past. So I think we need to look at some of those, the most kind of problematic behaviors that the kids are exhibiting that we're dealing with, and trying to understand, well, how could that behavior been protective for them in situations when they were being abused? So, and how we respond to those behaviors is critical. So I always like to, I'm a big go with the resistance person instead of trying to go and, go against it, because the second we get into a power struggle with a child, we've lost the battle. It's not, they've won. So really thinking about this idea. And I know as CASAs, you're not thinking of these kids as being bad, but sometimes our job too is challenging other people's perception and correcting some of those thoughts and ideas that they may be talking about when they're talking about the child. So along the lines of what I was talking about before, of understanding a child's kind of view of what's happening to them, behavioral responses after abuse that you may be seeing when you're going in to talk to these children, some of them are similar to what are signs of abuse, obviously: delinquency, violence, substance use, problem sexual behavior. So some children, to make sense of what's going on, may exhibit the same behaviors that have been done to them related to sexual abuse. Or if they come from a home, I can tell you that the biggest predictor of problem sexual behaviors in children is not being sexually abused themselves, which I think might be shocking to some of you. It's actually exposure to domestic violence and coercive control in the household. That actually, research is suggesting, is a much more higher predictor of a child acting out with problem sexual behaviors with other children than the sexual abuse themselves. So not that sexual abuse is not one of the ways, it absolutely is. But just to understand that, that's a whole other problem sexual behavior lecture I give, but I like to throw that statistic in there for these purposes. How their behavior and their sexual development is going to change, that can happen often. And sexual risk-taking, I think so many times, especially young women, are being labeled as promiscuous and almost these are victims of sexual abuse, but then because they are acting out with older men and doing things, that then they become almost the ones that we're trying to get in trouble for it, right? So enticing them and things like that. So thinking about and trying to understand that. And I guess the top one there, they may still love and want to see the offender. That is so critically important to understand, okay? When I've worked with kids where because of their behavior and them wanting to see the offender, the probation officer or judge may have looked at that and thought that they were a difficult kid, they might be lying, and that if they're acting out with boys, I've had people think, well, if they're acting out sexually with boys, then that means they haven't been true sexual abuse victims, because a true sexual abuse victim would avoid sex. No, that's not true. So kind of challenging some of these perceptions. Oops, no, there we go. Backwards. Okay, so I want to talk about Jenna. This is just a case that just is kind of a conglomerate case for me, where I've put together a bunch of things related to a child. But if we think about this child, we're thinking about a child that when I met with them and was doing an intake with them, they were skipping school, they were using drugs and alcohol, running away, stealing from their foster family. It was a big issue, the stealing and the running away. And it was a very supportive, understanding foster family. But that was part of the problem, as we'll learn, because this child was not used to people being understanding and supportive. So that was triggering to them, actually. So Jenna, where's my mouse, Mr. Mouse? So she was forced to have intercourse by her father before she was allowed to go out with peers. So she started being sexually abused at a very early age. But her father started making that a condition before she could go out and do things, that she would have to have sex with him or perform a sexual act. And that's what we kind of knew at the time. But then what we understood is that this abuse had been going on since she was 4. Her father had isolated her from other family members. She had a mother who had bipolar disorder, and he presented as being so much more stable that mom, and because of her mental illness, was completely, even though mom had suspicions about this abuse going on, was completely pushed out of the picture of this child's life. And so those initial allegations, because of mom's mental illness, were dismissed and not addressed. And that was at 4 or 5. And now we have a child who's 15. Okay. And that's not uncommon. You know, this happens. And I'm sure you've seen many cases like this. So how Jenna responded to this trauma was, many different ways, but she hated what her father did, but she loved her father. They lived out on this farm, which is isolating for her, but she had a horse, she had all these animals. So when all of this abuse was uncovered, she was pulled out of this home. She lost contact and interaction with her horse, her pets. She was put in foster care that was far away, and put in a different school. So she found being out of the abusive home was far worse for her, and would talk about that all the time. Then, I'd rather be with my dad and doing those things with him than all of the things that happened since. We had a trial, and at the end of the trial, her father was found guilty. The defense really used the guilt and shame she had about the abuse against her when she was interviewed on the stand. It was pretty disturbing. And she kind of questioned her own reality of what was going on. And she ended up begging the judge for leniency in sentencing. Okay. And so it might be hard for us to understand that. And I think sometimes people think, well, they should hate the abuser. Well, sometimes they don't hate the abuser. Sometimes they do. But that there's no right or wrong response to what's happening to them. It's their response. And I have seen CASAs time and time again be the one voice sometimes in that room that is honoring that child's voice, instead of somebody else's decision of how that child should be feeling or responding. So it's important. You guys do very important work. So thinking about how we could advocate for this child. And there's some comments in here that you guys are talking about. So it's really, there are lots of different things that could happen in foster care that I think they're trying to do, but funding is an issue in supports and trying to do all kinds of things, especially supporting young children, young women and their kids. So this is just, if you guys are looking for research, if you have to do something in court, you have to back up something that you're saying, that these are just some good articles to start with and to think about. So I have that, and those will be in the slides that you'll be getting. You don't have to write that all down now. But these are great reference articles that I have used in court as well when I've had to testify as an expert witness in certain trials and things. So again, really connecting, I look at your job is you guys work so hard to connect with these kids and be their voice. And part of that is going to be honoring their past experience. So knowing that these kids are going to have a complex and conflicted feelings about their offenders, and that they can hate what happened to them, but still love that person. And we really need to honor those feelings and reflect them. And I think that that is not always happening. Okay. children oftentimes who experience abuse and are removed from the home are told how they're supposed to feel. And so this is a quote, a few of you may know where this came from who are in this audience, but this was a quote from an adult survivor of sexual abuse. And she's done a few promos for the Traverse Bay Children's Advocacy Center, but this was taken out. But, you know, how everyone talked about her father as being this bad, horrible person, that these victims have to listen to this from other people all the time. And how do you think that makes them feel? So understanding that we may think we're doing something good by saying, oh, that was a horrible, bad person, but that may not be what the child needs to hear from us, okay? And so again, what we think about what happened is different than what they may perceive what happened to them. And so letting a child guide the language we use about the offender and honoring their experience, you're gonna have a lot more success in connecting with them. So, and this is just reiterating this issue that there can be a great deal of pressure on victims and caregivers from, I mean, especially social media. If you have older kids that are on social media and they're reading comments that are on a 7 and 4 news, you know, flash about this person being arrested for this, and oh, this person should be executed, or it should be, you know, these kids read these things, they hear things from investigators, other family members, that they have to hate or be angry. I've had to advocate for kids related to sometimes investigators who may decide, well, I don't think this child was really abused because they're not angry about it. Well, anger at the offender has nothing to do with the abuse being true or not. And so I think that those types of things are really important to understand, that how we feel we may respond to abuse when it hasn't happened to us is different than how that person and that child. So that thinking that if they haven't been simply angry at the offender or they're repressing their pain or may have problems later could be true, but it's not always true. And remembering that, you know, so how we talk about what happened to them will shape how they feel they can discuss things with us. Okay. And again, I'll address some therapy stuff. Jane, remind me at the end just to talk about therapeutic interventions. Another piece too that I think is important that you may be noticing when you're working with some of these children is misdiagnosis, that many times these kids either have been given tons of diagnoses while they were in an abusive environment, okay, which happens, or the second they get out of an abusive environment, they're brought to a psychiatrist or a psychologist or somebody and been given all of these diagnoses and put on medication. And so, you know, as an advocate for kids, I am always telling people that I am not going to diagnose and medicate a child who has significant trauma until I am better understanding if their behaviors are a trauma response or a true psychological disorder, which is different. Okay, ADHD is so often misdiagnosed with kids with trauma. Okay, because wouldn't you have trouble paying attention and focusing and attending if you had grown up in a completely dysfunctional and activating family? So you don't need Ritalin, you need support. And I'm not anti-meds, but I've seen children misdiagnosed with so many things. And families who abuse kids, bringing them to physicians and psychiatrists, and they don't meet with the child, they hear the parents of all of their symptoms and get medicated based on that. So really, it's really important. We're advocating for kids to coordinate with other agencies, professionals. And so if someone's going to community mental health, and we know that that child that we're representing is, to try to see what you can do to advocate that they are not put on meds or, you know, diagnosed with something that may not be appropriate yet, that we want to give them a little time. And I think the best example was that I worked with a 5-year-old child who was diagnosed at the time with bipolar disorder, early onset schizophrenia, autism. Okay, all of these things the parents had labeled this child as having. And once this child was removed from the home, where it turned out there was horrible, there was sexual abuse, there was horrible physical abuse, horrible neglect. This child was locked in a room for most of the day. That it took 2 to 3 years, but I can tell you that that child, who is now, this is 10 or 15 years later, has none of those diagnoses because it was all trauma response. they were hurting themselves and banging their head, not because they were autistic, but because they were traumatized and they had no other way of dealing with the pain they were experiencing. So understanding too that these children may not be what we think they are. And so when I have parents when the kids are being interviewed and they have a history of trauma that say they have all these diagnoses, I always take that with a grain of salt and just try to be with that child and try to understand where some of those behaviors are coming from. Is there a question, Jane, or are we going to save that to the end?
There's an addition. Bart has offered that as a kid with 9 ACEs, I can attest to so much of this. I cannot appreciate your efforts here enough, particularly the idea that there's no one way to react. We cannot intuit how children will behave, react, respond, etc.
Well, thank you. Thank you again, Bart. You've been very helpful during this. I appreciate your comments. They've been very insightful and supportive. So one of the last things I want to do in these slides before we open it up to some discussion, and again, Jane, please feel free if there's certain specific instances you want to make sure that I address too, is challenging some of the myths that we believe about sexual abuse. And I can tell you that these are not just general, these are things that most people, even studies have shown judges believe about sexual abuse. So that delay in disclosure of abuse, taking something back, or being inconsistent in the details are uncommon. And so that means that the kids have made it up, okay? That is a myth, that actually delayed disclosure and telling later is the rule, much more than the exception. Most people do not disclose till they are adults sometimes of abuse. When we get a child who at a children's advocacy center who discloses abuse even a few months or years after it happens, that is a wonderful thing because we can intervene earlier, but that is not the norm. Research supports that delayed disclosure is much more common. And that also that a child is not more likely to disclose to authorities, even when directly asked. So CPS or law enforcement, they tell people that they know and trust. So it could be, it's usually peers that hear about the abuse first, or a teacher or an adult who they do trust. So that's why, and if they disclose to family members, the inconsistency of details is going to be different. So just because they're telling somebody who's not an investigator, okay? And partially disclosing, just telling you a little bit and not telling you the whole thing, and then taking it back are much more common than previously thought. So these do not mean that this is not happening to the child. So the impression the child gives, the research is really interesting in court during interviews, may significantly impact decisions. And so research has shown us that a child's demeanor may have a stronger impact on people's evaluations than the content of their statements. And this includes police officers and judges and how they're interpreting a child's behaviors, this research. Sorry, I want to add a little more research, but since apparently I have all this black screen and I can't. Okay, no, I guess we're stopping there because don't you hate it when you have a little glitch in your
just a little glitch. We're used to, we can deal with those things.
Okay, there we go. So that just adding that there's strong evidence from studies of adult witnesses that the emotional behavior of a witness influences the perceived credibility of the witness. And so remembering all of this and how we're advocating and dealing with kids, that a child who is dissociating and hypo-aroused could be just as horribly abused, even though they don't seem as upset, than a child who's acting differently and more upset. So also the myth that the higher the trauma symptom level and intensity, the more severe the sexual abuse. This is not true. Okay, so many of us will determine the severity of symptoms, and there's individual factors that determine that, and that they may have nothing to do with severity. Again, a child could be acclimated, as horrible as that sounds, can be acclimated and used to certain types of abuse. So they may not have symptoms as strong as other kids. It's a really individualized kind of thing. And that a belief that some studies have shown held by both professionals and lay people is the notion that truthful children disclosing abuse will display strong negative emotions, like we talked about before, but that is not the case, and that Myers in 1999 found that jurors believed the child's demeanor would be a very important factor in forming their impression of how believable they perceive the child to be. And they perceived believability would affect the verdicts. And so part of this is, and this isn't your job, but part of my job that I try to do at the state level is trying to educate prosecuting attorneys on how we never should make the child put the responsibility of somebody getting convicted on the child's testimony. We need to have other people supporting and corroborating what's going on. And I know that a lot of prosecuting attorneys don't like asking therapists to talk, but being able to demonstrate what a child's behaviors they've experienced, what they really mean versus what they are, could be extremely important for juries to hear. So just thinking about those types of things. And that children that were described, as crying were considered to be more believable. So I've had battles with prosecuting attorneys where they don't want children to go into therapy until after a trial because they want them to be more upset on the stand. And I can tell you, it's not an uncommon response that I've had from prosecuting attorneys, but having somebody explain how therapy, and even asking a child on the stand, well, why, you don't seem to be getting so upset right now. What's happened? Well, I had counseling and I feel much better. How were you before? Well, this is how I was before. That alone could explain to a jury why their behavior is differently. So again, putting that on us to help, not the child to determine if this person's going to be convicted. Myth number 3, that children are fearful of the perpetrator and that will clearly display behavioral indicators. Again, I think based on what we've talked about, that the opposite may be true, and non-traditional responses may be just as legitimate. So I think that, and this discrepancy really can lead to injustice towards kids who display emotions that violate people's expectations. So extrapolating that to how we may think about the non-offending caregiver. If we need to give some grace to a child who is not responding traditionally to how we would expect them to traditionally respond to abuse, we also need to understand that it may take some time for the non-offending caregiver to want, not that they don't want to support their child, but why would you ever want to immediately believe that the person that you have loved and cared for all this time is now doing these things to your kid if you truly didn't know? So it may take them some time to understand, and they may have conflicting emotions. They can still love this person and hate what they did to their child. So again, understanding that those responses are not abnormal. People are just deathly afraid to ever talk about them because they will be persecuted or punished for them in some way. So remembering that, I just ask you to think about that a little bit. And myth 4, that most cases of child sexual abuse involves physical force and sexual intercourse, and that physical findings will usually exist. That is not true either. So that most of the time, physical findings are rare and often inconclusive, and many forms of sexual abuse will never have physical findings. So just to know that all of these things that are kind of common things that people believe are not accurate. So this, towards the end, I'm just sharing some information and some articles for you if you're interested in just caregivers, understanding non-offending caregivers' response to sexual abuse. This is a great article. And, obviously it's a protective factor if they're supportive, but just understanding the things that mitigate that. And that, that there's dimensions to caregiver support, believing the child, protecting the child emotionally, supporting the child, and obtaining resources for the child. So that how vital and important this is. This is probably preaching to the choir. This isn't, but at least it gives us backup and data to talk about how important it is, the parent's response, the non-offending caregiver. And that the other piece here is talking about sexuality and sexual health and behavior can be difficult for some caregivers. And so that's the piece where the more the sexual culture is to not talk about sex and not have proper names for body parts and all of that, the more likely you're not going to see disclosures in the home, because the child doesn't feel like they could be in trouble for saying something. And again, that perception, the child's perception of their relationship with the parent is what's going to determine how much they disclose. So parents' experiences of their child's disclosure after sexual abuse, these are just some themes. They try to make sense of it. they're negotiating their parental identity, and they're navigating the services. So again, they're going through a parallel process with the child. And so they may be initially interpreted as non-supportive and non-believing because they're just trying to figure out all of this. And I've had cases where initially a parent has been completely unsupportive, not because they don't love their child, because they just didn't want to believe it. And they were removed and put in foster care. But it was years later that we ended up having a session with that parent and that child where the parent completely apologized to the child for not believing them. So sometimes it takes some time, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. And here's just some other information related to, they really struggle to make sense of their child experiences. And so you'll hear this a lot from parents, why didn't my child tell me? And they may take that as an insult to them, right? My child tells me everything. They didn't tell me this. And so benefiting from all the complex factors of abuse, and that's where obviously sexual abuse stuff and other types of severe abuse, if you have a children's advocacy center you can utilize for supports, that's going to be very helpful for your client. I'm looking at Candace. I think it's Candace.
It is Candace.
Is there any legislation currently in place being discussed that would provide extra support for school-age children who have been diagnosed with PTSD or suffer from severe? I don't know of any legislation. I know that special education services take mental health diagnoses, especially PTSD, and consider that to be otherwise health impaired so that they can access services. But the biggest thing to me, and that I spent a lot of time doing when I was at the Traverse Bay CAC, was trying to educate school teachers and personnel on what trauma looks like with kids and how to process and engage with kids that are traumatized. And I think that's the biggest thing, is that it's just misunderstood and that they're looking at the behavior and not trying to understand what's behind it. So that would be my quick answer to that question. And then this is my last slide, and we'll open up to any questions or other discussion. But these are things that when people are working with children, and this is not necessarily your responsibility, but just I kept it in here to think about for you. If you want to connect, people with these things, is that, this is a good thing. Are there any experiences the family had that could influence their engagement in the process? Okay, so understanding the systems thing that we talked about. Anyone that can work with this child or the family, if they're going to be put back in the home, with abnormal versus normal sexual development, because my normal could be very different than your normal or abnormal. And so we need to have some common definitions and understandings of the sexual cultures in homes, because that's going to determine, especially if a child is engaging in problem sexual behaviors, how we're going to move forward to address some of those things. So that's an important thing to think about. And that really thinking about responses that siblings may have to disclosures and process, that not just treating the primary victim, that we need to be thinking about working with the whole family and understanding how they all have been impacted by those issues. And that kind of leads me just to a last little case vignette where, related to this, when I worked with, we had a CASA who did an amazing job on a case where it was a sexual abuse case where it was a adolescent girl who was sexually abused by her stepfather. And he was the primary caregiver for about 6 kids in the home that had not been victims of sexual abuse, and in fact had been very, very attached to dad. Dad was removed from the home. He was in jail, and eventually put in prison. And part of the process that was great from the CASA's perspective is that CASA really advocated strongly. We didn't have a lot of success sometimes in court with the judge to have these kids to still have contact with dad. Didn't have to be physical, face-to-face contact, but because we need to understand that when an offender is removed from the home, that can have a devastating impact on siblings and other kids. Those kids can then blame that victim for this happening, and that can be horrible. Or they can have significant trauma from completely losing contact and having no ability to process that loss, with the parent that's removed. And so these are things we need to think about, that it's not just about, if kids are physically safe and that person isn't interacting with them, there are many ways that we can work with kids in processing with an offender parent, so that we can transition them to be able to deal with that person being out of the home. And so those are also important things to think about when you're advocating for kids, is what is that person's absence, even though the presence had abusive pieces that we need to protect the kids for, what there are other pieces of that person's relationship with these kids that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about advocating for them. So that is
excellent.
My spiel for today.
It was an excellent spiel. I know I'm going to be rewatching the recording, but I did have a couple of questions that came in, Amelia, through the actual chat box. What types of special therapy might be available, or would you recommend to calm triggers of a traumatized child?
Well, there's all different types of therapy. And so the biggest thing is that if you're going to be referring a child to counseling, you want to find a therapist. This could be a social worker, professional counselor, a psychologist who has expertise and experience dealing with trauma. So that's going to be one of the things they're going to list, specifically childhood trauma. And you want them to have experience working with children and trauma. So those are the two things you want to look for. But there are many different interventions that can be effective. We have one type of intervention that we train pretty much all the therapists in Michigan at CACs is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which has them create a trauma narrative that they work on with a therapist to work through and talk about what happened to them and make sense of it. It includes the non-offending caregiver to share that story with, or who are foster parent or whatever. And it's a kind of structured, more regimented type of treatment. We have EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, which is another way to deal with and process trauma and integrate, because the problem with trauma is that most children and many adults don't have the ability to really talk about what happened to them, but they feel it in their body. And so movement type therapies also can be very helpful. And EMDR is a movement-based therapy. You're not required to talk about what happened to you. You're asked to recall it and kind of bring up an image, but not have to talk about it. And they do these eye movements to help reprocess and integrate the body experience to the mind experience so that you're healing and moving forward. But there's many, many different types of therapy. So I guess it's not as important. What I like is I like to, if I'm going to refer a kid, I'd like to refer them to somebody who has expertise in different types of interventions so they can make sure that intervention fits that child the best. Mm-hmm. There's some things, there's trauma-focused play therapy. For younger children, play therapy is going to be a much better way to engage younger children, like 5 and under. They're not going to do as well with talk therapy, no matter how good the therapist is. So having a therapist who is registered in play therapy, and there's even a type of play therapy called trauma play that is, specialized training in doing trauma work and integrating into the play therapy process. So are there any other questions related to that treatment piece that I can expand upon there?
No other questions related to that. There is a question, and I'm not sure that you're going to be able to answer it. I certainly have not heard about this, but somebody, I think we were talking about when you mentioned the teen moms that are, or teens that are pregnant. What is being done to foster teen moms with their babies? I do not know of an initiative like that, but
I don't know of any foster care initiatives. I can tell you that, and I only know this from my experience here in Northern Michigan in Traverse City, but I do know that throughout the state, they do have alternative high schools. So if I have a teen mom, so we have a high school called Traverse City High School here in Traverse City, and they have a whole program, daycare on site, not just for teen moms, but teen dads as well. Where the babies are at the school during the day, and it allows this young woman or the young man to go to class, go feed their child at breaks, interact with their child, and still be engaged in the learning process, get their diploma. And it is an amazing program. And I know it is not the only one available, but alternative high schools get a bad rap many times because they're, oh, well, this is where the bad kids go. But I can tell you that they can be a very healing, supportive, and trauma-informed environment, much more so than many other school settings. So looking into alternative high schools that might be in the area and seeing if they have those programs, that's what I would look at. I think that's where I see these programs being. I don't see them as much in foster care programs. They have done experiments throughout the country in certain types of, and not just for teen parents, but for having a foster parent and the parent that they're trying to integrate back with the infant living in the same home together. So the foster parents model the appropriate behaviors for that parent. And that would either be for a teen parent or for an adult parent. And they have been very successful, but it is extremely expensive. How do you have a home where everyone can live? So they're extremely expensive things to happen. But, they are out there. And like I said, alternative high schools, I think, are a good place to look for those.
Well, and to tag on along with that, I think it can be very overwhelming listening to all of these things. And as a CASA volunteer and say, oh my gosh, how do I find it? Well, you've got your staff at your local office and they know about these kinds of things. And so make sure that you're always keeping that dialogue open with them. Okay, another question came into the Q&A. Candace just wants to be reminded of the name of the training that you mentioned, Amelia, that is geared toward helping people talk about their traumatic experiences.
Well, if it's kids, I think I talked about EMDR, and I think I talked about trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is called TFCBT. TFCBT. Now, I can tell you, if you call, for most of you, I don't know how far throughout the state you guys are coming from, but most of you, if you can call and connect with your local children's advocacy center, who will be more than happy to give you information about the types of therapy they recommend for the types of abuse that a child might be. And then they may even know professionals in the community to refer you to for those things. So they're a very good resource. I'm obviously biased, but they are a very good resource to utilize if you're trying to figure out how best to help and navigate some of those things. Because I can tell you that community mental health centers are great in many ways, but they typically are much more reactive, and that children do not get services unless they have very, very severe symptoms. And so kids may not qualify for services there. So we have to look at other community agencies and supports to get them those treatments.
Okay. I don't have any additional questions in the Q&A. And I'm not seeing, I've reviewed the chat. I'm not seeing anything there. But I tell you what, sometimes I like to just test my own takeaways, but as I was listening to you, so many times I'm hearing, don't just take anything at face value, take a breath and look at it from a different perspective. Like, think about how your stuff affects their stuff and how parents' stuff could be affecting their child's stuff. And that hit home for me. Finding out just because you're in the home and you think the child is comfortable anywhere, that might not be the case. And what's bothering you the most, I guess, don't assume. And that's very powerful. And somebody mentioned in the chat, wow, that's a lot of self-awareness for a CASA. Well, you're not alone, but you don't have to diagnose everything, but it's just taking a breath and maybe walking around the situation and looking at it from another angle. I really appreciated hearing
and
that.
And I agree. I'm not expecting any one person to be doing all of these things, but I think if I could, if the biggest thing I could encourage you with your positions is to, because you're supposed to be representing that child's best interest, to as much as you can try to at least spend that time understanding the child's perspective of what happened to them and letting that child lead you to what. Now, again, you may have to interpret what they need from an adult perspective, but really honoring that child's perception and feelings about the abuse, that is so critically important beyond most other things, I would say, is that you doing that, you're going to build a relationship that is going to help you understand that child to be able to advocate for them in the best possible way. And then trying to connect them with resources that you're not going to feel like you can tackle for those other things.
Well, thank you so much. I want to honor your time, Dr. Siders, and everyone else's time. I want to thank everybody who came today, but thank you so much for sharing your information. Again, this has been recorded. It will go onto the michigancasa.org website, along with all of your materials. We appreciate you sharing that with us. We've learned a lot today, and I appreciate that. I just want to do a shout out for everyone that's still listening to join us next month for a discussion with Bridge Evidence Group's founders, Greg Go and Diane Hartig. They will, and they do this very skillfully, help lead us to understanding our own blind spots when it comes to advocating for LGBTQ+ children. So this, just like today, this is all information that we need as we work and speak for children in need in Michigan. Next month is on Tuesday, May 24th at 1 p.m. Tuesday, May 24th at 1 p.m. And the complete calendar is out there on the michigancasa.org website. Again, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.